What kind of man steals the windows to your very soul?
Charles Albright was known as the friendly neighbor, the handyman, the church volunteer. But behind his smile lived an obsession so grotesque it would earn him the name the Eyeball Killer. You're listening to Dark Radio, where the shadows speak and every story drips with the weight of true horror. Charles Frederick Albright was born on August 10, 1933 in Amarillo, Texas, into a world already marked by contradictions. He was adopted as an infant by Dell and Fred Albright, a couple who seemed stable on the surface, but whose approach to raising him would leave permanent scars. Dell, his adoptive mother, was fiercely controlling and obsessed with discipline. She demanded perfection from her boy, and when Charles strayed from the rigid path she laid out, punishment was swift, cold, and often bizarre. She forced him to dress in girls' clothing when he misbehaved, instilling both shame and confusion. She kept his world tightly bound, molding a child who grew up learning how to hide his true feelings behind whatever mask would please her most. To the outside world, Charles appeared like any other boy, polite, reserved, eager to please. Inside, however, a storm of resentment and darkness was forming. From an early age, Albright showed a keen interest in the human body. Taxidermy, in particular, fascinated him. His mother noticed his curiosity and, rather than dissuade it, encouraged him, buying him books, scalpels, and the preserved specimens he needed to practice. But when it came to finishing the details of taxidermy, especially the eyes, Charles became transfixed. His mother, frugal and strict, refused to buy him the glass eyes that professional taxidermists use, forcing him instead to sew buttons or crude substitutes into the sockets of his preserved animals. It was an early and chilling foreshadowing of what would one day become his signature, a fixation with eyes and the removal of them from living beings. As Charles grew, his intelligence shone. He was known as bright, even gifted, yet also restless. He dabbled in petty theft, breaking into houses, stealing from neighbors. Despite his early brushes with crime, he maintained the surface charm of a promising young man. Teachers noted his quick wit. Friends saw him as creative. But behind those qualities was a boy who could not resist the thrill of breaking rules, of testing boundaries, of taking what was not his. By his teenage years, Albright was already walking the line between promising future and looming downfall. He was arrested for petty thefts and burglaries, yet his mother often shielded him from the worst consequences. When he graduated high school at just 15, his intelligence seemed undeniable. He went on to college, enrolling in North Texas State, but trouble followed. He was caught with stolen items, again slipping into old habits. His charisma and boyish charm allowed him to talk his way out of many punishments, but the cycle of theft, deception, and manipulation became his constant companion. It was during these years that Charles's obsession with eyes deepened. He studied art, learning how to capture the human form, the subtlety of expression, and above all, the gaze. To him, eyes were not just windows to the soul. They were trophies, objects of control, a part of human identity he could fixate on. Friends noticed his strange interest. Some laughed it off. Others grew uneasy. But Charles himself never saw it as abnormal. For him, eyes were beauty, mystery, and power. He married young, to a woman named Dixie, and for a time it seemed like stability might anchor him. They had a daughter together. He worked odd jobs, from teaching to carpentry. He volunteered in his church. He fixed things for neighbors. On the surface, Charles Albright was the perfect small-town husband and father, kind, reliable, and deeply involved in the community. But that surface was only a mask. Beneath it lay a man who forged checks, lied about credentials, and manipulated anyone who trusted him. He posed as a teacher without proper degrees, faked qualifications, and even stole from those who relied on him. And as the years went on, his darker appetites, hidden beneath that mask of normalcy, continued to grow. By the 1980s, Albright was no longer the bright young man full of potential. He was a middle-aged man who drifted from Job to Job, who had divorced, who had betrayed friends and family, and who now lived a life propped up by lies and petty crime. But what most did not know was that his obsession with eyes had never left him. It had simmered, waiting for a darker outlet. Dallas, Texas, in the early 1990s was a city of contrast, wealth and power in some neighborhoods, poverty and desperation in others. It was here, in the shadowed streets and alleys, that sex workers walked the night, often unseen, often ignored. They were women who lived on society's margins, easy targets for predators, and it was here that Charles Albright began to stalk. The first known victim was Mary Lou Pratt, a 33-year-old sex worker. On December 13, 1990, her body was discovered in a Dallas neighborhood. She had been shot in the head. But what shocked investigators most was what was missing. Her eyes had been surgically removed. Not gouged out, not torn in a frenzy, but carefully, almost clinically excised. The precision chilled detectives. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they wanted and exactly how to take it. The city grew tense as word spread. Police were baffled. Why remove the eyes? What kind of killer would do such a thing? Just 2 months later, on February 10, 1991, another woman was found. This time it was Susan Peterson, 27 years old, discovered shot and discarded like Mary Lou. Again, her eyes were missing, surgically cut from her face. The pattern was undeniable. Dallas had a predator, one who was leaving behind a signature so grotesque it paralyzed even seasoned detectives. The newspapers began to whisper. The public began to fear. And as investigators scrambled, another body surfaced. Shirley Williams, 41, found on March 18, 1991. Like the others, she had been murdered. Like the others, her eyes were gone. But this time, the cuts were less precise, more jagged. It was as if the killer had been rushed, interrupted, or perhaps growing careless. Yet the message remained the same. Dallas was haunted by a murderer who stole the very essence of his victims, their eyes. The police nicknamed him the Eyeball Killer. Detectives worked tirelessly, piecing together witness accounts, studying the precision of the mutilations, searching for suspects. Sex workers, fearful of who among their clients might be the predator, whispered about a man with piercing blue eyes, a man who seemed kind one moment, cold the next. Slowly, suspicion began to circle Charles Albright. He was well liked in his neighborhood, known for helping with chores, volunteering, and painting. But those who knew him better remembered something stranger, his lifelong obsession with eyes. What investigators didn't yet know was that behind Albright's quiet smile and gentle demeanor lurked decades of deception, theft, and an obsession so dark it would place him among America's most disturbing killers. And as detectives began to close in, they would uncover a man who had lived a double life for years, hiding behind a mask of normalcy, all while harboring a compulsion that made him one of the most chilling predators Dallas had ever known. When detectives first turned their eyes toward Charles Albright, it was not because of solid forensic evidence, but because of whispers, patterns, and the strange gravity he seemed to have within the investigation. He was not a name drawn from a database of violent offenders, nor was he initially flagged by traditional leads. Instead, his presence emerged through the words of frightened women who lived on the margins of Dallas society, women who knew the streets better than the police ever could. Among them was Veronica Rodriguez, a sex worker who had narrowly survived a brutal encounter with a man she identified as Albright. She described him with an uncanny mixture of fear and disbelief. It wasn't like the usual John, she said. He was smoother, friendlier, with the kind of eyes that made her skin crawl. She insisted that he had attacked her, that he carried a gun, and that he was dangerous. At first, police were hesitant. Charles Albright seemed such an unlikely suspect. He was in his late 50s, a neighborhood handyman, someone who volunteered, painted, played music, and lent a helping hand to those around him. To neighbors, he was a figure of trust. But behind that carefully constructed facade, investigators soon discovered was a man with a criminal history that stretched back decades: burglary, theft, forgery, even accusations of molestation. While none of those crimes placed him squarely in the category of murderer, they painted a portrait of a man who could deceive, manipulate, and transgress without remorse. As detectives dug deeper, the pieces began to fit in ways that chilled them. Albright's fascination with eyes was no urban legend, it was fact. His childhood obsession with taxidermy, the crude button eyes he once sewed into animals, his studies in art, his focus on the gaze, it all pointed to a man with a disturbing fixation. Could it be that his lifelong obsession had escalated into murder? Surveillance teams were deployed, watching Albright's movements. He was cautious, polite, but strangely detached. He drove familiar routes, often circling areas known for prostitution. Detectives noted the way he seemed to scan faces, as if looking for something invisible to everyone else. Each night he prowled, the fear in Dallas grew. Sex workers refused to walk the streets.
Those who did carried with them a quiet terror that any client could be the one who never let them leave.
The breakthrough came through the testimony of Veronica Rodriguez. Though her account was fragmented, complicated by her own struggles with addiction, she remained steadfast in identifying Albright as her attacker. It was her words combined with mounting circumstantial evidence that gave police the courage to move. On March 22, 1991, officers descended on Albright's modest Dallas home. The search that followed would become infamous. Inside, they found what could only be described as a museum of secrets. Guns, ammunition, forged documents, stolen items, evidence of a lifetime of deception. But what truly disturbed investigators was the art. Paintings adorned the walls, many of them portraits, all of them with eyes rendered in painstaking detail. It was as if the house itself bore witness to his obsession. Among the tools seized were surgical instruments, scalpels sharp enough to explain the precision of the mutilations on his victims. Yet, despite the sinister nature of what was uncovered, there was a problem. No direct forensic evidence tied Albright to the murders. There were no fingerprints on the bodies, no blood in his home. No eyes preserved in jars, as some detectives half expected to find. Still, prosecutors believed they had enough. They built a case around the testimonies of sex workers who had encountered him, the mounting circumstantial evidence, and the chilling precision of his crimes. The story painted itself, an outwardly charming man whose obsession with eyes had finally erupted into violence, preying on the vulnerable and leaving behind a grotesque signature. As the trial of Charles Albright approached, the city of Dallas was transfixed. The media dubbed him the eyeball killer with a mixture of horror and fascination. Journalists filled the pages with lurid details of the crimes, and the public devoured them, caught between disbelief and morbid curiosity. How could the quiet man who painted neighbors' homes and played music at church also be the predator who stalked and murdered women in the shadows? In the courtroom, Albright maintained his composure. He dressed neatly, spoke politely, and denied everything. His defense attorney hammered at the lack of physical evidence. Where was the DNA? Where were the murder weapons definitively tied to him? Where were the trophies, the eyes that had been so meticulously removed? The prosecution countered with testimony after testimony, painting a portrait of a man who had lived a lifetime of deception, whose obsession had turned deadly, and whose victims could no longer speak for themselves. It was not a simple case. Jurors were asked to weigh the absence of forensic proof against the chilling mountain of circumstantial evidence and eyewitness accounts. They heard from Veronica Rodriguez, who described her harrowing encounter with Albright, and from other women who had barely escaped his grasp. They saw photographs of the victims, their lives brutally ended, their eyes gone as if erased from existence. They listened to experts describe the precision of the cuts, how they suggested not a madman lashing out blindly, but a man in full control of his compulsions. As days turned to weeks, the weight of the evidence bore down on the jury. And in December of 1991, Charles Albright was convicted, not of all 3 murders attributed to the eyeball killer, but of one, the murder of Shirley Williams. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For some, the verdict was justice. For others, it was far from enough. After all, the murders of Mary Lou Pratt and Susan Peterson were left officially unsolved, tied to Albright in the public imagination but never proven in court. Yet even with the conviction, unease lingered. Had justice truly been served? Or had a lack of definitive evidence left room for doubt? Albright himself never confessed, never offered explanation or closure. He simply faded into the prison system, his quiet demeanor unchanged, his secrets buried. For the families of the victims, the questions never stopped. And for investigators, one truth remained unavoidable. Charles Albright had been hiding in plain sight for years, his obsession with eyes woven into every part of his life, his mask of normalcy convincing enough to shield him from suspicion until it was far too late. But perhaps the most haunting part of the story is not what was found in Albright's home, nor what was said in court, but what was never discovered. To this day, no one has ever recovered the missing eyes. And without them, a chilling question lingers in the shadows. What did Charles Albright do with the trophies he took, and why were they never found? Prison did not strip Charles Albright of his mask. Behind bars, he carried himself with the same calm composure that had baffled investigators and unsettled the courtroom. He was polite to guards, respectful to staff, and even managed to cultivate relationships with fellow inmates. To those who didn't know his story, he might have seemed like any other aging prisoner serving out his time. But to those who did, the sight of him was a reminder that some predators never lose their calm, that evil can sit quietly in the corner, folded hands and a soft smile, and yet still radiate menace. Albright never admitted guilt. He never offered a confession, never expressed remorse, and never gave the families of his victims the closure they so desperately sought. When questioned, he would deflect or deny, claiming innocence even as the world outside knew him as the eyeball killer. It was this silence, this refusal to acknowledge the truth that deepened the sense of unease. Because the greatest horrors are not always the screams of monsters. They are the quiet denials of men who look ordinary, who act ordinary, but who leave behind carnage in their wake. Psychologists studied his case, fascinated by the strange cocktail of obsession, charm, and violence that defined him. Many pointed to his childhood, to Della Albright's suffocating control, her punishments, her strange encouragement of his taxidermy, and her refusal to buy him the glass eyes he craved. They speculated that his fixation with eyes had roots in shame, in control, in a twisted blend of fascination and deprivation. But psychology only explained so much. For those who had stared into the void left in the faces of his victims, no theory could erase the brutality of what he had done. In the prison system, Albright adapted. He taught art classes, painted portraits, and filled his time with the same creative pursuits that had defined his life outside. The irony was cruel. The man who had stolen eyes from the living now spent his days sketching faces, painting eyes with careful detail, reproducing on canvas what he had once stolen from flesh. Guards reported that he was meticulous in his art, that his portraits were lifelike, and that his focus on the eyes remained as intense as ever. It was as if he could not escape his compulsion, even when stripped of freedom. For the families of the victims, life after the trial was a slow march through grief. Mothers, sisters, and children of the women murdered by Albright often spoke about the way their lives had been hollowed out, how the absence of their loved ones was made crueler by the grotesque way their bodies had been found. The missing eyes became symbolic, not just of the killer's signature, but of the way he had robbed his victims of their dignity, stolen a part of their humanity that could never be returned. Some family members described nightmares where the missing eyes stared back at them, an emptiness that could not be filled. The city of Dallas tried to move on, but the case lingered in its history. Journalists revisited it in articles, documentaries, and late-night specials, always circling back to the same unanswered question: what happened to the eyes? The absence of those trophies was more chilling than their discovery would have been. If jars of preserved eyes had been found, it would have been grotesque, but at least there would have been closure. Instead, the void left behind fueled endless speculation. Did Albright dispose of them in some ritualistic way? Did he preserve them in a secret location that was never uncovered? Or did he simply discard them, leaving the world without answers? Over the years, new generations of true crime enthusiasts and criminologists returned to his story, dissecting it for meaning. Some saw him as a study in compulsion, a man whose entire life was a build-up to his ultimate crimes. Others saw him as a manipulator, someone who thrived on deception and control, who wore masks so convincing that entire communities failed to see the predator in their midst. And still others argued that the system itself had failed, allowing a man with a long history of deception, crime, and obsession to slip through the cracks until his violence finally became undeniable. For Albright himself, time marched on in the quiet monotony of prison life. He aged. His once sharp features softened. His body weakened. But even in his later years, when infirmity dulled his movements, his eyes remained piercing. Those who saw him in prison often commented on it, how his gaze could unsettle, how it seemed to linger too long, as if he were still searching for something that only he could see. Perhaps he was remembering. Perhaps he was reliving, or perhaps his obsession had become so much a part of him that even in the twilight of his life, he could not look at another human face without imagining the eyes removed. In August of 2020, Charles Albright died in prison at the age of 87. There were no grand headlines announcing his passing, no ceremonies, no closure, just the quiet end of a man who had once held a city in fear. For the families of his victims, his death brought a complicated mix of emotions.
Some felt relief that the man who had haunted their lives was finally gone. Others felt bitterness that he had taken his secrets with him to the grave.
And that is the haunting truth of Charles Albright's legacy. Not just the crimes themselves, but the void of unanswered questions he left behind. He was convicted of only one murder, though police believe he killed at least 3 and perhaps more. He never confessed, never revealed what he did with the eyes, never opened the door to understanding the full scope of his crimes. In the end, his silence became his final act of control, denying the world the truth, even as the legend of the eyeball killer grew in his absence. What makes Albright's story so chilling is not only the brutality of his crimes, but the ordinariness of the man behind them. He was not a monster who looked like one. He was not a wild-eyed stranger lurking in shadows. He was a neighbor, a handyman, a friend, a painter. He was the man you waved to while walking your dog, the man who smiled and nodded while carrying groceries, the man you thought you knew. And that is why the story of Charles Albright lingers, because it reminds us that evil does not always arrive with a snarl. Sometimes it comes with a smile. The mystery of the missing eyes remains unsolved. Perhaps they were destroyed. Perhaps they were hidden. Perhaps the truth was never as important to Albright as the act itself. The ritual of taking them, of leaving his victims empty, of knowing that he alone had stolen something irreplaceable. And maybe that is what makes his crimes resonate so deeply. The violation was not just physical, but symbolic. It was as if he wanted to erase the humanity of his victims, to strip them of their identity, to leave behind bodies that were not just dead, but incomplete. Even now, decades later, the question persists: why the eyes? Was it an artistic obsession, the final culmination of a childhood fixation? Was it symbolic, a way to possess the souls of his victims? Or was it simply compulsion, an act he could not stop himself from committing? The answer died with him. And yet in every retelling of his story, in every whispered conversation about the eyeball killer, the fear returns, not just of Charles Albright himself, but of the idea he represents. That behind every smile, every neighborly wave, every familiar face, there may lurk a darkness that is impossible to see until it is far too late. Long after Charles Albright was locked away, the shadows of his crimes still spread across Dallas like a stain that would not wash out. The city had lived through its share of violence, but the murders attributed to the eyeball killer carried a different kind of terror. It wasn't only the deaths. Dallas was no stranger to homicide. It was the signature, the brutal removal of eyes that turned ordinary fear into nightmare. People whispered in neighborhoods, in diners, in church basements. They whispered not just about the man himself, but about the possibility of what he represented. How many other men like him lived quietly among them? How many predators wore smiles and handshakes as their camouflage? The community's reaction to Albright was one of betrayal as much as horror. Neighbors who had once trusted him with odd jobs suddenly remembered moments when his gaze lingered too long, when his hands seemed just a little too precise, when his interest in eyes, whether in his art or in casual conversation, struck them as strange but harmless. In hindsight, those small moments became warnings ignored. For many, the lesson was cruel. Evil rarely arrives announced, and danger rarely looks like danger until it's too late. Journalists, true crime authors, and criminologists dissected the case. They pored over his childhood, his relationship with his adoptive mother, his teenage crimes, his long trail of forgery and deception. They argued whether his obsession with eyes was born from childhood deprivation, psychological trauma, or something more innate and unfathomable. Each theory seemed plausible, but none were satisfying. The truth remained locked inside a man who never gave answers, and that void of explanation only deepened the fascination. In the world of true crime, certain killers become cultural specters. Jack the Ripper, Ted Bundy, BTK. Each name carries not just the weight of the crimes, but the symbolism of what they represent. Charles Albright found his place among them not because of the number of his victims. Many serial killers left longer trails of blood, but because of the singular horror of his method. Removing the eyes of his victims made him a figure of folklore as much as fact. The act was so grotesque, so intimate, that it lodged itself in the imagination. Even those who never read the full details, who never followed the trial, remember the nickname, the Eyeball Killer. It is a title that doesn't fade because it preys on one of humanity's most primal fears, the violation of the face, the stealing of the gaze, the erasure of identity. Within criminology classrooms, the Albright case is often raised as an example of how obsession can escalate into compulsion and how compulsion can metastasize into violence. Students are taught to examine the subtle warning signs, the petty crimes that build over years, the manipulative behavior that erodes trust, the strange fixations that never seem to leave a person's life. They are told to see how a man like Albright lived for decades under the radar, never drawing enough suspicion to stop him before it was too late. For investigators, it remains a study in frustration, how a man so steeped in deceit could leave behind so little evidence, and how close he came to slipping through the justice system entirely. For the sex workers of Dallas, the fear was not academic. Their lives had been marked by vulnerability long before Albright stalked the streets. Society dismissed them, police often overlooked them, and predators understood too well that these women could be targeted without immediate consequence. Albright exploited that cruel imbalance, knowing his victims would not be missed by the powerful, that their deaths would not ignite outrage in the same way as others. And yet, in death, they became symbols. Mary Lou Pratt, Susan Peterson, Shirley Williams, their names carved into the record not only as victims of the eyeball killer, but as reminders of how society's indifference to the marginalized creates fertile ground for predators to thrive. The public reaction to Albright's crimes was also tinged with disbelief. How could a man so ordinary, so integrated into his community, commit acts so barbaric? It was the same disbelief seen in cases like Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, or John Wayne Gacy. Neighbors simply could not reconcile the man they thought they knew with the monster revealed. And in that distance lay the true horror. Because if Charles Albright could hide behind a mask of friendliness, then who else might be hiding behind masks in our own lives? The eyeball killer also forced society to confront the fragility of the systems meant to protect us. Albright's earlier crimes, his thefts, his forgeries, even his inappropriate behavior with minors, had resulted in arrests, probation, short sentences, but never long enough to stop him. Each time, he slipped away. Each time, he wore his mask a little tighter. Each time, he learned how to maneuver the system, how to remain just out of reach. By the time his crimes escalated to murder, the pattern had been set, a lifetime of deception, punctuated by punishment that never truly contained him. His story became a grim testament to how predators evolve in the gaps of law enforcement and judicial failure. In the years that followed his conviction, true crime media returned to Albright again and again. Documentaries framed him as the artist-turned-killer, his portraits juxtaposed with images of mutilated bodies. Authors dug into his biography, painting him as both a product of a warped upbringing and as an enigma beyond comprehension. Podcasts revisited the case, often with a hushed reverence, as if saying his name alone still carried weight. The eyeball killer had become a character as much as a criminal, a story that lived beyond the facts, a myth whispered in the dark. But beneath all the analysis and fascination, the legacy of Charles Albright is not about him. It is about the women whose lives he stole. Women whose faces became headlines only because of the violence done to them. Women whose eyes, once filled with life, with hope, with fear, with humanity, were taken and never returned. The brutality of their deaths is what people remember, but what should be remembered is who they were before they became symbols of horror. Each one had a story, a family, a life cut short, and each one deserved more than to be defined by the man who killed them. Even today, when Dallas residents recall the eyeball killer, the memory carries unease. Some remember the fear of walking the streets at night, the way conversations hushed when another body was found, the way the community seemed to hold its breath until an arrest was made. Others remember the media frenzy, the headlines that reduced complex lives to gruesome details. And others still remember Charles Albright himself, the neighbor who smiled, who offered to paint, who seemed so normal until he wasn't. The horror of Charles Albright lies not only in what he did, but in the silence he left behind. Silence in the courtroom as he denied everything. Silence in prison as he refused to confess. Silence in the grave as he took his secrets with him. And in that silence, the questions remain echoing louder than any confession could have. Why the eyes? Where did they go? And how many more victims might there have been? The psychology of obsession is a labyrinth that has swallowed many men whole, and in the case of Charles Albright, it was a thread that wound through his life like a dark tether. From his earliest years, people noted his fixation on eyes, not simply as an artist's detail, but as something deeper, stranger, unsettling. When he painted, the eyes were always the most meticulously rendered. When he studied taxidermy under the watch of his controlling adoptive mother, he was taught to replace the glass eyes of birds with precision, as if restoring their souls. But in Albright's world, restoration turned to violation. The eyes were never simply details. They were symbols of power, of control, of taking something that could not be given back. Psychologists who studied his case often speculated about the roots of his fixation. Some believed it traced back to his mother, Didelle, a woman who demanded perfection and ruled her home with iron control. She corrected Charles relentlessly, forbidding mistakes, punishing failure, and instilling in him both discipline and resentment. To a boy like Charles, eyes may have become the ultimate source of judgment, the gaze of a mother who could never be pleased, who never looked at him with true affection. To take the eyes of his victims, then, may have been to erase judgment itself, to extinguish the gaze that haunted him since childhood. Others point to the act as symbolic of possession. To hold the eyes was to hold the identity of another human being. Eyes are often called the windows to the soul, and in ripping them away, Albright was stripping his victims of humanity, making them objects, trophies to his private obsession. And yet, despite endless speculation, no one ever found the missing eyes. That absence, that void, became as infamous as the crimes themselves. It raised the question, did he keep them? Did he discard them? Did he hide them in some secret place known only to him? His silence only deepened the mystery, leaving psychologists and investigators with theories but no truth. When compared with other killers, Charles Albright occupies a unique niche. Ted Bundy was driven by narcissism and sexual sadism, Dennis Rader by domination and ritual, Richard Ramirez by chaos and cruelty. Albright, however, was defined not just by the act of murder, but by a signature so bizarre, so surgically precise, that it set him apart. He was not the most prolific. He was not the most charismatic. He was not even the most cunning. But his obsession branded him in a way few others had been branded. The name Eyeball Killer became inseparable from his identity, a grim moniker that erased the man and left only the monster. For criminologists, the fascination lies in how a man with such an obsessive ritual could mask his darkness so effectively for so long. Albright did not live as a recluse. He did not isolate himself in basements or forests. He was a neighbor, a handyman, a friend. He attended social gatherings, smiled at children, shook hands at church. He crafted a mask of normalcy so convincing that it shielded his true nature for decades. And perhaps that is the most frightening truth of all, that a man with such a grotesque fixation could exist in plain sight, unrecognized, even trusted. His trial exposed these dualities in stark detail. Prosecutors painted him as a predator who planned his crimes with cold precision. Defense attorneys argued circumstantial evidence, claiming he was a scapegoat, a convenient suspect for crimes the police desperately wanted to close. Albright himself sat quietly, rarely betraying emotion. His eyes, those same eyes that fascinated him so, fixed on nothing in particular. To observers, it was as though he had retreated into himself, guarding the truth, refusing to give the world the satisfaction of understanding him. His silence was not just a refusal, it was a weapon. In withholding the truth, he retained control. Even locked away, he denied closure to the families of his victims, denied answers to the investigators, denied catharsis to the public. The allure of the Eyeball Killer case lies not only in the horror of the crimes, but in the questions that remain unanswered. Why did he remove the eyes? Was it ritual, fetish, symbolism, or something beyond comprehension? Were there more victims, bodies undiscovered, eyes unaccounted for? Did Albright's mask of normalcy allow him to hunt more than the courts ever proved? Each unanswered question feeds the legend, ensuring that the story of Charles Albright endures not just as a case study, but as a haunting. Media comparisons often link him to killers who carried strange rituals: Ed Gein with his skinning, Jeffrey Dahmer with his fixation on control and dismemberment. Yet Albright's crimes were in some ways subtler, cleaner, more surgical. His precision suggested calculation rather than frenzy, obsession rather than impulse. And it is this precision that unsettles even seasoned criminologists. Frenzied violence is understandable in its chaos, but the calm, practiced removal of eyes from a victim suggests a mind that found purpose in the act, a ritual repeated until it became second nature. For law enforcement, the case remains a reminder of the fragile line between eccentricity and danger. Communities often overlook the oddities of their neighbors, dismissing strange hobbies or obsessions as harmless quirks. But in Albright's case, those quirks were the shadows of something monstrous. His fascination with taxidermy, his obsession with painting eyes, his history of deceit and petty crime, all of it pointed to a man rehearsing for something greater. Yet no one connected the dots until the bodies began to appear. For society, the legacy of Charles Albright is a cautionary tale about indifference. His victims were women on the margins, sex workers ignored by the city and dismissed by many as disposable. Their disappearances did not spark outrage. Their deaths were not front-page news until the horror became too grotesque to ignore. It was only when the detail of the eyes emerged that the city truly paid attention. That perhaps is the darkest indictment, not only of Albright, but of the community that allowed him to hunt with so little resistance. And still, the fascination lingers. Books, documentaries, podcasts, they return to Albright again and again, mining the horror for understanding, for meaning, for fear. His crimes have been immortalized not just because of their brutality, but because of their strangeness. He did not simply kill, he erased. He stripped his victims of the gaze, the eyes that bore witness to the world, the eyes that reflected their humanity. And in doing so, he forced us to confront a primal terror, the loss of identity, the theft of the very thing that makes us seen. In the end, Charles Albright is remembered not as a man, but as a symbol of obsession's power to corrupt, of society's failure to protect its most vulnerable, of the monstrous masks that ordinary faces can hide. The eyeball killer story is not simply about murder. It is about the darkness that can thrive behind closed doors, in quiet houses, in the man next door. It is about the eyes we meet every day, never truly knowing what might lie behind them. The years that followed Charles Albright's conviction were marked not by revelation, but by silence. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and yet the courtroom did not close the book on the eyeball killer. If anything, it left more pages unwritten, because Albright refused to speak, refused to explain, refused to confess beyond what the court had already proven. The mystery of his crimes remained suspended in the air. For the families of his victims, that silence was a second wound, a denial of closure. They knew what had been taken, but they would never know why. Prison records described him as a quiet inmate, polite, even mild-mannered. Guards spoke of a man who kept to himself, who avoided confrontation, who lived in the shadows of the cell blocks as though he were a ghost. Fellow inmates said he rarely raised his voice, rarely drew attention, and seemed detached from the brutality that filled the prison halls. It was as if the storm had passed, leaving only a husk, a man drained of the very obsession that had once driven him. Or perhaps, some wondered, the obsession never left. Perhaps it simply no longer had an outlet. Outside the prison walls, the city of Dallas continued to wrestle with the legacy of his crimes. Reporters revisited the case in anniversaries, filmmakers turned it into documentaries, criminologists dissected his psychology in journals and classrooms. And always the same questions resurfaced. Where were the eyes? Why the ritual? Was Charles Albright guilty of more than 3 murders? The police suspected it. Prosecutors hinted at it, but without evidence, the number remained frozen in uncertainty. Some speculated that Albright had killed long before 1990, that his precision suggested practice. Others wondered if his age, already in his late 50s when arrested, meant his career had been a late eruption of violence. The truth remains buried, sealed within his silence. For Dallas, the case was also a mirror. It reflected the city's neglect of women who lived on the margins, women whose lives were not valued until they were taken. The sex workers Albright targeted walked streets lined with indifference, their disappearances rarely reported, their voices rarely heard. The eyeball killer forced Dallas to face that indifference, to acknowledge that predators thrive where victims are invisible. In the years after his conviction, local activists and organizations called for better protections, better resources, and a more compassionate view of women who sold sex to survive. The legacy of Albright's crimes was not only horror, but also a slow, painful awakening. As for Albright himself, his silence preserved his power. He remained a subject of fascination precisely because he never revealed himself. Other killers wrote memoirs, gave interviews, basked in their infamy. Albright did not. His refusal left space for myth, for speculation,
For the imagination of a public both horrified and captivated, he became not just a man but a riddle. And in that riddle, his story endured. He died in 2020 at the age of 87 in a prison hospital after decades of confinement. His death was quiet, unremarkable, a stark contrast to the chaos he once caused. Yet even in death, the questions remained unanswered. The missing eyes were never found. No confession ever surfaced. No secret journal was discovered, no hidden trove of trophies unearthed. He carried the truth with him into the grave, leaving behind only shadows. For the families of the women he murdered, it was the cruelest end of all. Justice may have imprisoned him, but the truth was buried forever. And so the story of Charles Albright lingers like a ghost. A man who seemed ordinary, even respectable, who shook hands with neighbors and smiled at acquaintances, yet who hunted women in the night and left behind bodies marked by a signature too strange to ignore. His life as a study in contrast, the artist obsessed with beauty, the taxidermist obsessed with detail, the fraudster obsessed with deception, the killer obsessed with eyes. Each role intertwined, each mask layered over the other, until the man and the monster became indistinguishable. For those who seek to understand the darkness in human nature, Albright's story is both warning and riddle. It warns us of the dangers of indifference, of ignoring the lives of those most vulnerable. It warns us of the mask ordinary men can wear, masks so convincing that even friends and family cannot see what lies beneath. And it challenges us with a riddle. How do we ever truly know another human being? How do we recognize the monsters who hide among us? There is something profoundly unsettling about eyes. They are symbols of truth, of recognition, of connection. To look into someone's eyes is to acknowledge their humanity. To lose that gaze is to lose the reflection of self. Charles Albright understood this in a way no one else did. He stole not only lives but gazes. He extinguished the windows to the soul. That is why his crimes continue to haunt us, because they touch something primal, something deeper than murder alone. When you think of Charles Albright, the eyeball killer, you do not think of his home, his jobs, his neighbors. You think of eyes. You think of their absence, their silence, their mystery. And in that absence, you feel the chill of a truth that will never be fully known. The man is dead, but the horror remains. A scar etched into the history of American crime. A whisper in the dark corridors of Dallas. A reminder that sometimes the scariest monsters are not the loudest, but the quietest. The ones who smile politely, who walk unnoticed, who seem more than they should. Because in the end, Charles Albright saw his victims not as people, but as objects of obsession. And in stealing their eyes, he stole something from all of us, the belief that we can ever truly see the danger that hides in plain sight. If the shadows of this story unsettled you, you're not alone. Evil often hides behind the most ordinary faces. Subscribe to Dark Radio for more real-life darkness brought into the light. And remember, justice may sleep, but it never dies.